saying, so I'm Kevin Mackay, I'm a professor here at Mohawk College. I teach social sciences. I teach about politics and world affairs. So what we're going to be talking about today, what we're going to be listening to from Mr. Lascaris is something that I think is very important. I want to say as well too that we're at a post-secondary institution. We're at a place that believes in, or should believe in, free and open debate, dialogue, freedom of speech. So to that end, I think Dimitri has been very clear. We are fine to hear critical comments, questions. That is okay. That this isn't supposed to be some sort of completely controlled, one-sided presentation. Dimitri has his own experience. He's going to share it with us. It's a unique experience. I think it's an important one. But afterward, there will be time to ask questions. Okay, I mean that personally. It's okay if you're critical. Even. We just hope that we can all be respectful. Okay, because it is possible, I think, to talk about even difficult and controversial issues. And folks, war is difficult. War is controversial. There's a lot of intense emotions involved. But we can be respectful in our dialogue about it. And so, our goal here is to try and keep that conversation respectful, but not to suppress contrary opinions. So, anyway, with that, I think what I want to do is introduce Brendan Stone. Henry is here. That's great. Henry Evans Tenbrink will be reading a land acknowledgement, and then Brendan Stone will be introducing our guest speaker.
Thank you for coming out, and just want you to know that debate is more than welcome. All points of view are respected, no matter what your point of view is, and we thank you for showing up tonight. The city of Hamilton is situated on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe to share and care for resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the city of Hamilton is home to many Indigenous people from across our island, North America, and we recognize that we must do more to learn about the rich history of this land so that we can better understand our roles as residents, neighbors, partners, and caretakers. The Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement is an Indigenous citizenship law made between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations in 1701 that extends from Montreal to Fort Erie. It consists of 3 basic rules. Take only what you need, leave some for everybody else, and keep it clean. In addition, we stand in solidarity with murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, transgender, and two-spirit people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry. I know you look forward to that every time, so thank you. My name is Brendan Stone. I'm co-chair Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, the sponsoring organization for this tour stop, and also one of the main sponsors for the national tour of Dimitri Lascaris. I'm here to introduce Dimitri. Actually, his official bio, or what you might call the information on the website, is quite short, too short really. It says, Dimitri Lascaris is a Canadian lawyer and journalist who you can learn about on his personal website, dimitrilascaris.org, which has many great articles. Here it says, in April 2023, this year, Dimitri embarked on a self-financed trip to Russia where he lectured to students, presented at a think tank, gave interviews, met officials and peace activists, appeared on Russian media, wrote articles, and tweeted daily about what he saw and heard. Now you can hear about Dimitri's citizen diplomacy in person or online. I would just add to that, of course, we've known Dimitri for a while, or known about Dimitri because of his journalism, news networks, on video, on YouTube, live streamed online. Did a lot of work on Palestine, especially when it was more controversial to do that. Put himself on the line a lot. When we heard he was running for the leadership of the Green Party a couple of years ago, we were very excited. That's exactly the kind of voice we want to see in Canadian politics, and we participated in his campaign for leadership of the Green Party. And of course, he did not run, but he came very close. It was very exciting for the people involved. We were watching it here and had events here in Hamilton about Dimitri's Green Party run. If we had someone like that in Ottawa in office, talking about Palestine, talking about anti-war, talking about Haiti, talking about the global south, it would be a very refreshing change there. So we're very excited about that, and the people that worked with us on Dimitri's campaign are also often working with us on this tour. So it's kind of crystallizing people who want to do more with figures like Dimitri and reinvigorating the Canadian left to some extent. So that's great news. Dimitri, selfless as he is self-financed this tour too. He's not asking for speaking fees. We're just doing venue bookings and that's it. So very generous of Dimitri. So thank you, Dimitri. Let me welcome Dimitri Lascaris.
How's this? It's wonderful to be back in Hamilton. This is a city that just vibrates and pulsates with activism and militancy and progressive values, and I always come here feeling inspired and being even more inspired. And I want to say a word about the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. Probably it's not the best metaphor, but when we were driving over here, I told Ken Stone and his colleagues that they are the tip of the peace sphere in Canada. I got to find a better metaphor, but the bottom line is that you'd be hard-pressed to find a single peace group in Canada that has been as devoted to the cause of peace and as active to the cause of peace as the Hamilton. Now, you've seen outside that there are some people who object to the views that I've been expressing about this war. I think anybody who looks objectively, with the modicum of objectivity at the mainstream discourse in this country, would appreciate immediately that those who support NATO's activities in this war, those who support the Ukrainian government of Volodymyr Zelensky, those who support the arming of Ukraine, those who blame Russia 100% for this conflict and think that Western governments are blameless, they are given ample and endless opportunities to express their points of view in the mainstream media. You hardly ever hear from people who are going to say the kinds of things that I will tell you tonight, and yet when we make some effort to bring our message to the people because the mainstream media has blackballed us, we are effectively silenced, or efforts are made to silence us. There were a number of messages that were sent to the owner, very hostile messages that were sent to the owner of the London venue where I spoke last night, effectively threatening his business with unspecified consequences. Scandalous allegations were made about me. Today, a representative of the UK and Canadian Congress sent a message to the venue in Toronto telling them that they should be ashamed of themselves for allowing me to speak and they should cancel the event. There have been people in Victoria who have been buying massive amounts, registering massive amounts of tickets so that they will sell the event out and not show up. And all I have to say is, look, if you want to engage me in a debate, if you want to disagree with me, you want to criticize me, I welcome the engagement. But let's allow each other a reasonable opportunity to speak, and let's engage in a civilized dialogue. The stakes, after all, are far too high for us to silence anybody in this conversation. It's far too important. So with that, I'd like to launch into my presentation today. Now, on November 22nd of last year, something that isn't been appreciated much in the Canadian public, I think, humanity was nearly plunged into World War III. What happened at that time was 2 missiles entered from the airspace of Ukraine into Poland and killed 2 Polish farmers. And immediately, and this is a pattern we've seen over and over and over again in this conflict, the Western governments and Western media, mainstream media, rushed to blame Russia. And you'll see here, this is an article that was published, I believe, in Reuters, and it quotes in the subheading, a senior U.S. intelligence official has said Russian missiles crossed into NATO member Poland, killing 2 people. Now, as many of you will know, Article 5 of the NATO Treaty contains an obligation of reciprocal defense. Exactly what it means is a matter of some legal debate, but essentially it imposes some kind of an obligation on all NATO members to come to the defense of any NATO member who is attacked, and for that purpose to use military force. if it is deemed necessary to do so. So this alleged entry of Russian missiles, so-called Russian missiles, into Poland potentially triggered Article 5 and plunged all of NATO, including Canada as a NATO member, into war with a nuclear-armed state. Yet within 48 hours, the truth emerged. And NATO said, as did the Polish government and the US government, that the missile that hit the Polish farm was fired by Ukraine, not Russia. Who fired it exactly, why it was fired, whether this was an accident, whether this was intentional, I don't purport to know the answers to these questions, but NATO governments themselves admitted that these were Ukrainian missiles and not Russian missiles. And appallingly, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, even after the Polish government itself said that these were Ukrainian missiles, not Russian missiles, continued to insist that the missiles had been fired by Russia and that Russia had attacked a NATO member. You'll see that in the third paragraph here of this article up on the screen, that even after it was accepted that the missile had not been fired by the Russians, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky continued to claim it was a Russian attack on NATO. I agree with Noam Chomsky that we are living through the most dangerous moment in human history. I have not undertaken this journey, I did not go to Russia, and I don't expose myself to the criticisms that I've had to confront out of the some kind of perverse sense of masochism. I've done this because I'm passionately convinced that we are in fact living in the most dangerous moment in human history.
You lost batteries.
Hello?
Yeah.
So why do I, well, it looks like it's dying.
Let's switch batteries, sorry.
Welcome back, Dimitri.
Check. So, why do I say that? Why do I say that this is the most dangerous moment in human history? Well, first of all, we have gone well beyond the danger point that we reached at the climax of the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was never actually an exchange of lethal fire between Soviet and United States forces during the course of the Cuban Missile Crisis. What is happening here is effectively that and much more. We are sending weapons to Ukraine of increasing lethality. We said we wouldn't send main battle tanks, we did. We said we wouldn't send long-range missiles, we did. So, sabotage. Maybe I should just speak up. Hello? We said we wouldn't send F-16 fighter jets. Apparently we're not going to do that as well. In addition, we are providing real-time battlefield intelligence to the Ukrainian forces for the purpose of killing Russian forces. We have imposed economic sanctions on Russia, which are clearly designed to cause immense and perhaps even permanent damage to its economy. Citizens of our countries who have served in NATO militaries are on the front line fighting alongside Ukrainians with tacit, if not explicit, approval of NATO governments. How is this not a war? We are effectively at war with Russia. It is a war in all but name, and the fact that our government hasn't had the decency to debate openly a declaration of war in Parliament doesn't mean we're not at war. It just means our government is profoundly dishonest. None of this ever happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, some of you who are as old as me will remember that in Afghanistan, in the conflict where the Taliban, or the Mujahideen I should say, were fighting a war against the Soviet forces back in the 70s and the 80s, the United States armed the Mujahideen with Stinger missiles and other forms of small arms, and much less lethal weaponry than is being used today. Sorry, folks. try to do this the old-fashioned way. So, if at any point I'm not speaking loudly enough for people in the back, just please put up your hand, let me know. So, as I was saying, during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, during that war, as many of us know, we were arming the Mujahideen against the Soviet forces. And this was an initiative that was spearheaded by a member of Congress known as Charlie Wilson, and this was the book that was written about this story. And I want to draw your attention to the line above the name of the author at the bottom, George Creel. And you'll see it says the largest covert operation in history. Covert. We were providing far less lethal weaponry to the Mujahideen, and we felt that the situation was so dangerous that we had to do it covertly. What are we doing today? We are in fact flaunting the fact that we are giving weapons to the Ukrainians to kill Russians. And this war is not happening in Afghanistan, which is at a considerable distance to the capital of Russia, Moscow. It's happening a few hundred kilometers from Moscow. And we even have U.S. weaponry being used to attack the territory of Russia itself, principally in the Volgograd region. And we also know, according to U.S. officials, that some segments of the Ukrainian government launched drone attacks on Moscow itself. So we are well beyond the danger point we achieved in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and all of this is happening in the backdrop of an existential climate crisis. This war is preventing us from achieving the kind of international cooperation that we need in order to resolve that crisis which is spinning out of control in any kind of manner that will allow the conditions for civilized life to continue. We must bring this war to an end before we are eviscerated by a nuclear holocaust, and if we survive that, we'll be wiped out, potentially, by the climate crisis. This is a matter of existential importance. That's why we have to have this discussion, and that's why I've come here to speak to you today. Now, in my presentation today, I'm going to divide it up into 4 parts. First, I'm going to tell you what my position is, because I think that my position has been systematically misrepresented. Then I'm going to explain to you why I have that position. Then I'm going to talk to you in summary fashion about what I think I learned from my trip to Russia and Crimea. And finally, I'm going to talk to you about what I think, as one citizen, a peace deal might look like.
Crimea is Ukraine, not Russia. So when you say you went to
Excuse me, sir. Sir, there's a time for questions. There's a time for questions, okay? It's not about you. It's not about
You don't need to name call.
I think your reaction is a perfect example of not listening, because what I actually said, if I may, sir, what I actually said was Russia and Crimea. I chose, excuse me, sir.
Sorry.
I chose those words very carefully. I did not equate Crimea with Russia. You're attributing to me a statement I didn't make. Now, my position is first and foremost that Western governments should provide robust humanitarian aid to the innocent victims of the war, but that aid should be delivered to the victims directly, because we have ample evidence that the government of Volodymyr Zelensky is corrupt. The Ukrainian people themselves, in a poll sponsored by the Wall Street Journal, after Zelensky was elected, said that corruption in Ukraine at high levels of government was a threat to the national security of the country. We should not be giving that aid to the Ukrainian government. We should deliver it through NGOs, through international organizations, directly to the Ukrainian people themselves. Secondly, we should give sanctuary to Ukrainian refugees. Not in preference to other refugees, we should give robust protection to all refugees, including to Ukrainian refugees. Thirdly, I think that we should impose an arms embargo on both sides, Ukraine and Russia. We should not be providing any form of military assistance to either side. Fourthly, other than an arms embargo, I don't believe that we should be imposing sanctions without United Nations approval, the approval of the Security Council, on Russia or any other country. That's a violation of international law, and it is clearly designed not to harm the Russian government, but to harm the Russian people themselves, whether or not they support this war, for the purpose of creating political instability in Russia. Finally, or fifthly, we should adopt a legal prohibition on the nationals of our country
fighting this war on either side, whether for Russia or for Ukraine. And finally, we should, in every conceivable way, express and provide our support for negotiations between Ukraine and Russia to end the war, including, if both sides welcome it, our participation as a mediator in those negotiations. Now, the mainstream media will have you believe that this position that I've just articulated is an outlier, that I'm an extremist, that this is a fringe point of view. Well, let's look at who is actually providing weaponry to Ukraine. This map, which was compiled by The Economist, a pro-Ukraine Western media organization, shows us who has provided military aid to Ukraine. As you can see, it is almost entirely the West. Almost nobody in Latin America has provided military aid to Ukraine, including our trading partner, our close trading partner, Mexico. Almost nobody in Africa, almost nobody in the Middle East, and almost nobody in all of Asia has provided military aid to Ukraine. 48 countries in the world have provided military aid. 146 countries have not provided military aid. The U.S. is by far the largest donor. According to the Kiel Institute, up until February 24th of this year, the U.S. contributed U.S. $43.2 billion in military aid to Ukraine, which is 60%, a substantial majority of total military aid to the country since the invasion began. And total military aid to Ukraine in that period amounted to US $72.5 billion, which is larger by a significant margin than Russia's annual military budget. Okay? So we are, and bear in mind that Russia, being a massive country, can't allocate all of its military budget to the battlefront in Ukraine. Only some portion of that is allocable to the Ukrainian conflict. So we have actually given to Ukraine an amount of military aid, we in the West, within the past 12 months or so, that is potentially double what Russia itself is able to commit to that particular theater of conflict. Not even in Canada itself is my position an outlier. In February of this year, the National Post did a poll on a variety of issues relating to Ukraine and found that 32%, only 32% of Canadians support sending more weapons to Ukraine. So the vast majority of Canadians do not express support for that proposition. And bear in mind that this is happening in a media environment in which people like myself are being shut out, and every effort is being made to convince Canadians to support sending weapons to Ukraine. Imagine if there was a neutral discussion going on in the mainstream discourse, how low that level of support might be. It could be well below 32%. That's the best that they can do with all of their pro-war propaganda. Now what about sanctions? I said we shouldn't be sanctioning either side other than by means of an arms embargo. Well, who's imposed sanctions on Russia? Again, this is from The Economist. You'll see, again, almost nobody in Latin America, including Mexico, is imposing sanctions on Russia. Nobody in Africa is imposing sanctions on Russia. Almost nobody in Asia, other than the vassals of the United States government, Japan and South Korea. And then, of course, we have Australia and New Zealand, predictably following the American line. The vast majority of countries in this world, representing the vast majority of the human population, have not imposed sanctions on Russia. So the reality is that the position I've articulated to you here today is mainstream globally. It isn't an extreme position. It isn't fringe. It isn't an outlier. In the world at large, the position of the Canadian government is the outlier. They are the extremists. They are the fringe segment of the global population. Now, before I launch into an explanation of why I've taken this position, I think it's important to emphasize that we have to recover our ability to think critically about this conflict and about all war in which we've become embroiled. The majority of mainstream media reports in the West, if you look at them carefully and you dissect them, are based almost entirely on claims of the US government or by the Ukrainian government. So let's just stop there and think about that. Why would anyone take at face value the claims of the US government about a war? The Pentagon Papers, Daniel Lascaris, days ago, one of the greatest whistleblowers in the history of whistleblowers, before he passed away, and he said that the United States, in his opinion, had provoked this war, he revealed to us, at risk of being in prison for his entire life, that 4 presidential administrations in the United States have lied systematically to the American people about the Vietnam War and about the carpet bombing of Cambodia and Laos. The Afghanistan papers, which are much lesser known, prove to us that the US government and other NATO governments have systematically lied to us about the war in Afghanistan. We know to a certainty that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We know to a certainty that the US government employed torture against people who had been convicted of no crime. Why do we know that to a certainty? Because Obama, when he ran in 2007 to be the President of the United States, he told us so. And then he proceeded to immunize all of the CIA torturers and the people in the US government who had authorized the torture for any form of accountability. So if you believe the US government, anything it tells you about a war, I've got some swampland in Florida to sell you. Now, let's talk for a second about Ukraine. I mentioned these articles that you see in the mainstream media are based almost entirely on claims by the US government or the Ukrainian government or both. Well, I would draw your attention to this statement by the head of the EU foreign policy, Josep Borrell. He made this a couple of weeks ago. He said if we don't support Ukraine, Ukraine will fall in a matter of days. A few days later, Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, went even further. He said if we stop sending weapons to Ukraine, Ukraine will disappear tomorrow. Now think about the implications of that. I look at this as a lawyer. I think about motive. I think about incentive. If you're a Ukrainian government and you know that your existence depends upon the support of the West, and that the Western government's willingness to continue sending billions of dollars of weapons is going to depend upon the public reaction to this policy, you have a profound incentive to vilify to the maximum possible degree your enemy. And at every opportunity to generate outrage, anger, fury, and not only to convince the Western publics that the enemy, in this case the Russian Federation, is the embodiment of evil, but that if they win this war, they will then come after us, even though there's no evidence that Russia ever intended to attack a NATO country. And in fact, it's amazing, given everything that's happened last year, that Russia has not yet attacked a NATO country. So the incentive of the Ukrainian government, and I would say this about any government, this is not even an indictment of Ukraine per se, any government that depends upon external support for its very existence is going to do everything it can rhetorically to convince the electorates of those countries to continue to support the policy of their governments. It's just inevitable. So we can't take at face value what either the US government is telling us or what the Ukrainian government is telling us. And we shouldn't do that with respect to Russia either. What we should do with respect to all three is demand independent, corroborating evidence. And if there is none, then we should assume that the claim is nothing more than that. It's just an unsubstantiated claim. But in fact, what has happened in the Western media discourse is that every time a claim of an atrocity is made against the Russian government by either the US government, one of its Western allies, or the Ukrainian government, it is presented to us as irrefutable fact, whether or not there is any independent evidence to corroborate the allegation. So if the US government, and I think we can say this with a high level of confidence based upon its prior conduct over the last several decades, is not really motivated by human rights and democracy and international law, what is its real objective in Ukraine? Well, I think the record is clear. Its real objective in Ukraine is to perpetuate the era of United States global hegemony, which began with the fall of the Soviet Union. Russia, by all measures, objective measures, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this, has become economically and militarily strong over the past 20 years. It has developed a very close relationship with China. China now has an economy which, measured by purchasing power parity, GDP, is larger than that of the United States. China and Russia together have considerable technological sophistication. Together they have massive amounts of resources. They have a huge population, massive territory. They have growing influence in the global south. This is a challenge to United States hegemony, ladies and gentlemen. And that's what this war is about. It is not about saving the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainian people are being cynically exploited by the United States government and Western governments in order to weaken a geopolitical rival, and when this is finished, they could not care less. about what happens to Ukraine. Now I know there are a lot of really conscientious people out there. Perhaps this gentleman, I'm sure he genuinely and passionately cares about Ukraine. The people out in this hall genuinely and passionately care about Ukraine. But I ask them to reflect upon the true intentions of the United States government. Where is this war heading? What is the ultimate objective of Joseph Biden? Is he in fact a champion of democracy, human rights, or international law? Or is he a ruthless exploiter of the vulnerable peoples? And I think the record is clear. It tells us what the answer is. And all persons of conscience, whether they are pro-Ukraine or not, need to consider carefully the record of the United States government in determining where this is all heading. Now, you won't hear these voices. You don't have to listen to me. The people, there are lots of people out there who are far more reputable and accomplished than I am, who have essentially adopted this very same position. And I'm just going to mention a few of them. Noam Chomsky, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, Professor Radica Design at the University of Manitoba, Jacques Beau, a former Swiss intelligence officer, Professor Nikolai Petrov, who was a U.S. State Department advisor for Eastern Europe under the administration of the elder Bush, Professor Ivan Kachanovsky, a Ukrainian Canadian from the University of Ottawa, Tamara Lorenz, a doctoral student at the Balsillie School, and Professor Paul Robinson, a former officer of the British military who is now a professor at the University of Ottawa. These are just a few of the names of the many reputable people out there who have been excluded from the mainstream discourse but have exactly or essentially the same message to give you as I'm offering to you today. So what are the true causes of this war? I think it behooves us to examine that to assess the merits of the position that I've articulated to you. There is no doubt, based upon the historical record, that NATO governments assured the government of Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not expand eastward. You don't have to take my word for it. You can go look at the National Security Archive of George Washington University, a reputable U.S. university that is closely tied to the United States government. They have dozens of declassified documents, and this is what I'm showing you on the screen. It's a screenshot of their website, which show beyond a shadow of a doubt that, in their words, a cascade of assurances were given by multiple governments, the German government, the British government, the American government, that NATO would not expand eastward. William Perry, the U.S. Defense Secretary under William Clinton, threatened to resign over NATO expansion because he thought that was such a dangerous, provocative, and ill-advised policy. One of the leading lights of American foreign policy in the 1990s, George Kennan, he told the New York Times that the expansion of NATO into Central Europe was the most fateful era of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. Current CIA Director William Burns, a few years ago when he was a diplomat in Russia, he interviewed people across the political spectrum about NATO expansion. Liberals who were opposed to the Putin government, people who were to the right of Putin, people who were centrists, and he reported back to the United States State Department in a classified cable that everybody across the political spectrum in Russia was antagonistic towards NATO expansion and viewed it as a threat to the Russian Federation. And the only reason we know about this is because that cable was leaked to us by WikiLeaks. What is another cause of the war? We've been told there was no coup in 2014. I think that it's remarkable that people would even make that claim with a straight face. So obvious is it that there was a coup. And here you have a picture of Senator John McCain before he passed away. He went to Kiev. He sat alongside ultranationalists who were opposed to the government of Viktor Yanukovych and encouraged them, supported them, and condemned the democratically elected president of Ukraine. Whatever one may say about Viktor Yanukovych, even the West acknowledged that he was democratically elected in 2010. And here's McCain openly and publicly exhorting Ukrainians to overthrow him, standing alongside ultranationalists. In a Canadian Dimension article written by Professor Ivan Kachanovsky, whom I just mentioned, and this was a peer-reviewed study that he did, he found the following, according to him. According to testimonies by over 100 wounded protesters, several dozen prosecution witnesses, and forensic, ballistic, and medical examinations by government experts, the massacre of the absolute majority of protesters at the critically important Maidan Square protest in Kiev on February 20th, 2014, was perpetrated principally by members of the Maidan opposition, not by security forces under Viktor Yanukovych, the supposedly pro-Russian president who was overthrown. And specifically, Professor Kachanovsky says, the far-right elements of the Maidan opposition. They were the principal cause of violence on that day, but the West attributed the violence almost entirely, if not exclusively, to the Yanukovych government. But here's the cream on the pie. This is the pièce de résistance. We have a leaked recording of a conversation that took place between a senior U.S. State Department official, Victoria Nuland, and the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine at the time, Jeffrey Pyatt, in which Nuland can be heard clearly deciding who the next prime minister of Ukraine is going to be. And it was Arseny Yatsenyuk. And in fact, after she said to Pyatt in this conversation, Yats is the guy, he's the guy we want to be the prime minister, not Klitschko, who's currently the mayor of Kiev and whom the EU favored, but Yats did in fact become the prime minister after Yanukovych was overthrown. Now let's just stop there and think about what we would say if these facts were inverted. Let's imagine that in 2016, during the election, or shortly after the election, contested by Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, the CIA leaked a recording of a conversation between the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, and the Russian ambassador to the United States at the time. And in that conversation, Lavrov says to the ambassador, Trump is the guy. He's our man. And sure enough, Trump becomes the president. Would anybody in this room deny for 1 second there had been aggressive meddling, at a bare minimum, aggressive meddling by Russia into the internal politics of the United States? This would probably be viewed by the American elite as a cause for war. And yet when the Americans do it in Ukraine, oh, there was no coup d'etat. How dare you suggest that there was a coup d'etat? So obvious is this coup d'etat that George Friedman, who at the time, in 2014, was the head of Stratfor, a geopolitical consulting firm with close ties to the United States government, he referred to this, the overthrow of Yanukovych, as the most overt coup d'etat in history. That's how obvious it is. So what happened? What happened when he was overthrown? His support, Yanukovych's support, came principally from those areas that are now controlled by Russian forces. And I spoke to a lot of people when I was there who came from those areas, and what they said to me is, they stole our vote from us. We voted for Yanukovych. They took that away from us. They took away our democratic rights. You can disagree with them, but that's how they feel. A lot of those people feel that their democratic rights were taken away from them, and therefore they rebelled. And a civil war erupted, which caused over 10,000 people to be killed. And that was in 2014, when this war really began. Not in 2022. What is another cause of this war? Yes, ladies and gentlemen, there is a serious neo-Nazi problem. The media in the West said this repeatedly over the last 8 years. All of a sudden, after the invasion, it was no longer convenient to acknowledge the existence of this dire problem in Ukraine, the power of the armed neo-Nazis and ultranationalists. But before the invasion, this was routinely acknowledged by Western media. And here's an example, a Reuters article from March 2018, Ukraine's neo-Nazi problem. Haaretz, the most progressive newspaper in Israeli mainstream media, in December 2018, Ukraine designates a national holiday to commemorate Nazi collaborators. This wasn't some fringe party that did this. This was the Ukrainian parliament that did this. And the Nazi collaborator in question is Stepan Bandera, whose odious legacy includes creating a political organization which, as Lev Golinkin, a Ukrainian-American analyst, has said, caused the deaths, the murders of tens of thousands of innocent Poles, Jews, and Russians. This was a virulently anti-Semitic organization that was involved in the most heinous of atrocities, and the Ukrainian parliament in December 2018 declared a national holiday in honor of this man, Stepan Bandera. As Mr. Golinkin said recently, In 2015, the Ukrainian parliament passed legislation making 2 World War II paramilitaries, the OUN and Ukrainian Insurgent Army, heroes of Ukraine, and made it a criminal offense to deny their heroism. Think about that. Not only are they honoring him with a national holiday, but they're saying if you dare to deny that this Nazi collaborator and mass murderer was a hero, you could go to jail. And this was before the invasion by Russia, not afterwards. And even afterwards, albeit reluctantly, you have mainstream media organizations like NBC in March 2022, after the invasion, saying Ukraine's Nazi problem is real. Even if Putin's denazification claim is, I don't even know what that means, but clearly NBC is acknowledging that there's a serious problem with neo-Nazism in Ukraine. And we, in our country, had the indecency, our military, to actually go and train those people. Neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian military. What's another cause of this war? As I mentioned, a civil war broke out after Yanukovych was overthrown. This was entirely foreseeable that this would happen. Leading luminaries of the U.S. Foreign Policy Committee in the 90s foresaw that this was going to happen. And in the lead up to the invasion, in the latter part of February of last year, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe noted that there was a massive increase in shelling on the line of contact. What the Russians said is that this looked to them like preparation for an invasion of the areas controlled by the pro-Russian separatists. And that is a reasonable point of view if you look at the evidence. I spoke to a man who is now, and you can see my interview of him on my website, a man who is now a math professor at the University of Moscow who came from the Donbass, came from a community that's very close to Donetsk, is about 10 kilometers from the front line, and he said back in those days, in 2020 in February, people who were coming across the line of contact were reporting that they were seeing massive amounts of Ukrainian military equipment being moved up to the front line. And they were seeing forms of weaponry that they had not seen before. And when you combine that with the increase in shelling, it very much looked like there was about to be an invasion by Ukrainian military forces who had been heavily trained, heavily armed by NATO over a period of 8 years, into this area that had rebelled against a government that could legitimately be called a coup regime. Why should we oppose weapons transfers to Ukraine? That's why I have this position. Why should we oppose weapons transfers to Ukraine? Well, first and foremost, because what's at stake is the very survival of humanity itself. It's a miracle that we've gotten to this point without a nuclear war, frankly. And we are testing our good fortune to the max every day. I wake up in the morning, there are days where I praise the heavens that I wasn't incinerated by a nuclear weapon in my sleep. All of us should think very carefully about how fortunate we've been thus far. What's another reason to oppose weapons transfers to Ukraine? As I hope I've demonstrated, Russia has some legitimate grievances. Does Russia's government lie? Yes. Like all governments, it lies. Does it disseminate propaganda? Yes, just like our government does. But sometimes Russia's government tells the truth. Even the U.S. government sometimes tells the truth. Maybe that's too close.
By accident.
At the end of the day, we should not simply assume that everything Russia's government says is false. We should use our critical thinking capacity and test it against the historical record. The historical record supports key elements of the Russian government's narrative. And just because the Russian government says it doesn't mean you're a disseminator of propaganda. The issue is, does the evidence support the claim? Whether it's the Russian government that says it, the Ukrainian government, the American government, or any government. Another reason that Russia has legitimate grievances is there was NATO expansion, the promise which was violated. There was U.S. interference in the internal politics of Ukraine, which by American standards did constitute the orchestration of a coup. They accused Russia of orchestrating a coup in the United States in 2016 on far lesser evidence than the Russians have against the Americans. Then there's tolerance of and support for Ukrainian neo-Nazis, an attack on pro-Russian Ukrainians in the Donbass. These are legitimate grievances, ladies and gentlemen. And the way to solve a war is to recognize the other side's legitimate grievances. You too have legitimate grievances. The Ukrainian people have legitimate grievances. Their government has legitimate grievances. But to pretend that there is one side that's pure evil and one side that's saintly is a denial of reality. Finally, here is what I would say is the ultimate reason for everybody, including those who are passionately committed to supporting the state of Ukraine, to oppose weapons transfers. Because this is the war that Ukraine cannot win. In the realm of reality, it is almost certainly going to lose. And why do I say that? It has been universally acknowledged by military experts that the primary source of the killing is artillery. Most of the casualties are being caused by artillery. The Western media and Western military experts have all acknowledged that Russia has a gigantic advantage in artillery. And in fact, here you have an article from a mainstream Spanish newspaper, El País, saying that Ukraine is outgunned 10 to 1. 10 to 1. Russia's population, depending on how many people have left Ukraine, and that's not entirely clear, is anywhere from 4 to 6 times larger than that of Ukraine. Now this is math, people. You don't have to be a doctoral student in physics to understand this. One side has a 10 to 1 advantage in artillery and has a population that's 4 to 6 times as large as the other side. Someone's going to run out of soldiers a lot faster than the other side, and that side is Ukraine. Ukraine cannot sustain this rate of attrition, even if Ukraine was equal in terms of artillery capacity. It could not sustain this rate of attrition against Russia because it has a far smaller population to draw upon to replenish its military losses and personnel. Not only that, Russia has far more combat aircraft, bombers, cruise missiles, and air defense systems. Russia has hypersonic missiles. Not only does Ukraine not have hypersonic missiles, no NATO government has hypersonic missiles. Russia has far greater oil reserves, which are essential not only to the functioning of the Russian economy and the Ukrainian economy, but also to the sustainment of large-scale land war. And Russia has a far larger industrial base than Ukraine. And so whatever you may think of Russia's justification for militarily intervening and invading Ukraine last year, why would you support a policy if you really care about the Ukrainian people, which will almost certainly end in their destruction? This makes no sense to me. Even if you're 100% convinced that this is entirely the fault of the Russian Federation, it makes no sense to prolong and perpetuate a war that will only end in the obliteration of Ukraine. And we're watching that happen in real time, and it's horrifying. Now, Western elites have said over and over again, they aim to strengthen Ukraine's negotiating position. But the reality is that Ukraine's negotiating position is getting weaker. Ukraine just lost the bloodiest and most painful battle of the war in Bakhmut. Ukraine, since the gains of last fall, which were significant, where we took areas in Kharkov, we took areas on the western bank of the Dnieper River, has made no significant advances, has been steadily losing territory back to Russia. And if this continues, and if there is, as I think any rational person would expect, a collapse in the Ukrainian military, Ukraine might also lose its last remaining access to the Black Sea and become a landlocked nation. It continues to control Odessa. It continues to have access to the Black Sea. The longer this war goes on, the greater that access, which is absolutely critical from a strategic perspective to the well-being of the Ukrainian state, would be lost. We are actually weakening the state of Ukraine with each passing day of this war. A peace deal now would enable Ukraine to limit its losses, and critically, to retain access to the Black Sea. Another reason to oppose the arming of Ukraine. This war is an ecological catastrophe. The destruction of Nord Stream, and I think when you look at the record, it was very likely the US government that was behind it. And even the US government itself admits today that it wasn't the Russian government. They're now pointing the finger, in fact, US officials at Volodymyr Zelensky. Whoever did it, we know it wasn't the Russians, even the Westerners say so. It was the single largest release of methane in recorded history. Ukraine is being flooded with weapons, which, according to the head of Interpol, in a warning issued last year, many of which will end up in the hands of criminal organizations. That is another reason to oppose the arming of Ukraine. And finally, I should say that this is costing a lot of money which could be used to address pressing domestic needs. Homelessness, poverty, the deterioration in our healthcare system, the transition to a renewable energy economy. These billions upon billions of dollars are making it harder for our governments to address the dire needs of the most vulnerable members of our society and to address a climate crisis that threatens the very future of our children. So with that, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what I learned when I was traveling in Russia and Crimea. And I want to say a few things by way of disclaimer. I was only in the country for 1 month. So I don't purport to be an expert. No one could become an expert in any country by visiting it for 1 month. There was no invitation, and there was no welcoming committee. I made a decision on my own to go, and once having made that decision, I applied by myself for a visa. I was granted the visa, and at that point, I contacted, for the very first time in my life, the Russian embassy in Ottawa. I requested a conversation with the ambassador. He kindly granted to me a conversation. In that conversation by Zoom, I explained to him what my intentions were. I asked him to put me in touch with people from the foreign ministry who were familiar with Canadian-Russian relations. I asked him to put me in touch with economic experts. I asked him to help me find somebody who might be able to guide and translate for me, and he very kindly undertook to do that. And this led to a number of meetings, which I'm going to summarize for you in a moment. Another thing I want to say by way of disclaimer, I was not paid a dime by anybody to go to Russia, not a single dollar at my expense, and I ended up paying somewhere in the range of $10,000 to do this. That came entirely out of my own pocket. No one even offered to compensate me or defray any part of my expenses. And there has never been a time, in all the writing that I've done about this war, in all the writing I've done in Russia, and all the appearances on RT, something that the pro-Ukrainian community complains about a lot, the fact that I do interviews on RT, I've never been paid a dime for anything. For the dozens of articles on my website, not a dime. I don't even take donations on my website. I don't collect donations from my audience. Because I want people to understand that this has nothing to do with money. As simple as that. I'm fortunate not to need the money, and I want everybody to know that that is no part of my motivation. Another disclaimer, my trip was confined to central Moscow. And while I spent 20 days in central Moscow and walked probably well over 150 kilometers, that's just a tiny part of Russia. And it may not at all be representative of what's going on in the rest of Russia. And I think that that's something we need to bear in mind as intelligent adults when you hear what I have to say about what I learned and saw in Russia. Of course, I didn't conduct any polls. And the people that I spoke to may not be representative of Russian public opinion at all. So what did I do? In large part, thanks to the assistance of the Russian ambassador to Canada. I spoke at the Valde Club, which is an economic think tank, about the movement towards de-dollarization, the abandonment of the US dollar as a global reserve currency. I gave a lecture at Mackay University, which is considered to be the elite university for the training of Russian diplomats. I spoke to graduate students about Canadian foreign policy there. I met with about 20 different experts at IMIMO, described to me as Russia's largest think tank. They talked to me about finance, sanctions, the petroleum industry, United Nations relations. That was very informative, and they were very friendly and very humble, frankly, in my interactions with them. I visited a homeless shelter that was operated by a charity. I visited the Russian International Affairs Council, which was founded by the current Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, and I spoke there for 2 hours with the director about the prospects for peace, and then I did an interview on RT on the program Worlds Apart. In Crimea, I traveled from Moscow to Simferopol, which is the capital of Crimea, by train. It was a 28-hour journey. Before going there, I contacted an American documentary filmmaker by the name of Regis Tremblay. I've never spoken to him before, but he lived in Yalta. I needed somebody to help me, and he suggested to me that I hire his partner, who's a professional translator, and she became my guide. So I went to Yalta, I saw Yalta, then I went to a former Soviet submarine base, nuclear submarine base, in a place called Balaklava, which is near Sevastopol. I went to Sevastopol itself. Then I went to the Kherson border between Crimea and Kherson is right in the thick of the war. And there I interviewed non-governmental Russian humanitarian workers who were helping refugees leave the Kherson war zone and go to various destinations, some of them to Western Europe, some of them were staying in Crimea, others were going to Russia, the Russian Federation. So these were my impressions from speaking to people. And I spoke to dozens of academics, students, economic experts, humanitarian volunteers, journalists, and ordinary citizens. The vast majority of them expressed support for Russia's government and argued that its military intervention was necessary. Those who had lived through the 1990s spoke at length about the hardships of that era, and I'm going to come back and say something about that, and how life in Russia had improved under the Putin government. I encountered universal contempt for Boris Yeltsin. Nobody had anything good to say about that man. And to the extent that there was criticism of Russia's government, it was from the right. In other words, people complained to me that Vladimir Putin was too soft, Vladimir Putin was not being aggressive enough, Vladimir Putin should have invaded Ukraine earlier, Vladimir Putin coddles traitors. One such traitor, I put that in quotation marks, who was identified to me was Anatoly Chubais, who was largely responsible for the neoliberal, the fanatical neoliberal program that was imposed upon the Russian people in the 1990s. These were the kinds of criticisms that I heard. And people were quite willing to articulate those criticisms. I didn't hear anybody say Russia should never have intervened in Ukraine. Again, you can agree or disagree, but these were the sentiments that were expressed to me. And these sentiments, frankly, were consistent with the polling data. What I'm showing you here is data from the entire Putin era, published by the Levada Institute in Russia, which has been treated by Western media organizations as a reputable polling institute. And in fact, the leadership of this institute is viscerally critical of Vladimir Putin and his government. There are no friends of Vladimir Putin. And what they show on their website, you can go check this out yourself, is that for the entire time that Putin has been the president, popular support for Putin has fluctuated between approximately 60% and 82%, and it's currently in excess of 80%. What Western leader can claim to have that level of support? Now, why might that be? Well, propaganda undoubtedly has something to do with it. It is true that the Russian government has restricted to a significant degree free speech. I believe that that's the case. I think the Russian government should be criticized for that. But to pretend that there are no other reasons, that it's all just because people have been indoctrinated, is to ignore the socioeconomic evidence. These are statistics from the World Bank. And what they show is that the poverty rate in Russia, from the time that Putin took over to the end of 2021, fell from 29%, almost 1 in 3 Russians were in poverty when Yeltsin's era ended, to about 12%. During the Putin era, life expectancy increased dramatically. You can see here, in the left-hand side of the chart, that there was a dip. It went down to about 63 years, the average lifespan of Russians in the middle of the 1990s, the Yeltsin era. And it rose by the time we get to about 2018 to 73 years. It's well over, it's about a 15% increase. It dipped significantly during the pandemic, for obvious reasons. But even after that dip, the average lifespan of Russians, of ordinary Russians, was well above where it was in the middle of Boris Yeltsin's era. What about unemployment? Look at the spike in unemployment during the 1990s, during the Yeltsin era. These are all World Bank statistics. Look where unemployment is today. It's almost at a historically low level in Russia. You may recall, some of you who were old enough to follow the press back in those days in the 90s also, and I don't have a graph to show you this, but you can check this out for yourself, that Russia was a fiscal basket case. There was a financial crisis. It defaulted. Russia today has the lowest debt to GDP ratio of any major economy in the world. It has one of the lowest debt to GDP ratios in the world, period, whether you're talking about a major economy or a minor economy. These are objective reasons why Russians might prefer the era of Putin to that of Boris Yeltsin. And yet, what does the historical record show? This is the cover of Time magazine, 1996, after Boris Yeltsin secured a second term. What does it say? Yanks to the rescue. The secret story of how American advisors helped Yeltsin win. Can you imagine if in 2016 Pravda put out a cover and said the secret story about how Putin's advisors helped Trump win? What would the reaction be? Russians remember. You'd have to be living in La La Land not to understand, as a Russian who lived through that era, that not only were the Russian people far worse off than they are today, but that the Americans had their dirty hands in all of this from day one. And what they want is another Boris Yeltsin. That's what this is all about. That's not to say that Putin is perfect. It's not to say there's plenty you can criticize about Vladimir Putin and his government. But would the Russian people really be better off under the second coming of Boris Yeltsin? And finally, this is the IMF. The IMF predicting economic growth over the next 2 years. It's predicting a contraction in Germany and the United Kingdom, an expansion, albeit modest expansion, in the Russian Federation, notwithstanding the imposition of these sanctions. I'm going to move ahead quickly because we don't have a lot of time. I want to talk to you finally about what a negotiated peace might look like. And I'll say that I come at this as a lawyer with 30 years plus experience in dispute resolution. I'm a litigator. And fundamentally what we litigators do is we help people who are in legal disputes come to a resolution. If they can't do that by way of what we call a settlement, a contract, we go to court, and a neutral arbiter has to decide who's the winner and who's the loser. So basically what we do as litigators is the jurisprudential equivalent of a battlefield. Of course, the war is different because people are actually dying, but the stakes of litigation can be very high. It can be hotly contested. Emotions can get out of control. This happens all the time. And you come to learn some things about dispute resolution after you do this kind of thing for 30 years. Okay, first of all, it's important to identify who are the true counterparties to the negotiation. In other words, whose interests are really at stake and who is actually controlling the conduct of the other side. If you're speaking to somebody who has no decision-making power, you're not going to solve this. Secondly, you have to distinguish between posturing and a bottom line. Everybody entering into a negotiation will posture. They will bid high, expecting that they're going to be negotiated down. Almost nobody comes into a negotiation telling you what their bottom line is. That's certainly true of the Russian government. Fourth, we cannot achieve a negotiated resolution without a change in tone. When I started my legal career, I quickly earned the nickname of the pit bull. Why do people call me the pit bull? The lawyers in Bay Street, they call me the pit bull. Because every time I sat across some other lawyer and I was negotiating, I was telling them how evil the clients were. You know, they're fraudsters, they're scam artists. They can't be trusted, they should all be in jail. I learned really quickly that that is poison, that kind of language. And whatever I may think, whatever my feelings may be, you have to restrain yourself and learn how to speak diplomatically in order to achieve a negotiated outcome. Look at how we talk about the Russian government today. Does anybody think that this is conducive to a negotiated resolution? And compare the way Russian leaders talk about the West. In my opinion, they actually are trying to strike, sometimes they fail, but they're trying to strike a tone which will at least leave open the possibility of a negotiated resolution. We have abandoned any effort on our side to adopt such a tone. And finally, and most importantly, nothing ventured, nothing gained. What do you lose from sitting down at the table and trying to negotiate a resolution? I mean, what's the downside? Especially when the potential cost of failure is so high. But we won't even try. This is an unpardonable sin, in my opinion. Now, Volodymyr Zelensky has been saying over and over again, we won't negotiate until Russia withdraws all of its forces from what he calls Ukraine. Okay? And what he calls Ukraine, of course, includes Crimea, and it includes the 4 oblasts, which have been purportedly annexed by the Russian Federation. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a ridiculous precondition. Again, when I was starting out my legal career, I had a habit of, when I got to a point in a major case against some well-heeled opponents that I thought maybe we could do a deal, I would say things like, we'll negotiate, but your clients have to agree to pay at least $50 million. Okay? Click. Almost no one will go to a negotiation with this kind of a precondition. If the Russian Federation were to withdraw all of its forces from these areas before the negotiation even begins, it would lose 90% of the leverage it has in those negotiations, number one. Number two, it would be unable to explain to the Russian people why tens of thousands of Russian soldiers gave their lives, just so that they can give up this territory without a peace deal in place. Number three, all of those people living in these areas who are genuinely opposed to the government in Kiev and who are sympathetic to Russia would be exposed to potentially lethal retribution by Ukraine's military and security forces. So by putting this condition, this precondition on negotiations, what Mr. Zelensky is effectively doing is guaranteeing that there will be no negotiations. Russia has never said anything like this. So why not sit down at the table and see where the discussion leads? And if you find out that the Russians are unreasonable, go back to war. But it's incumbent upon you to try. Now, when I was in Moscow, I visited the Russian Federation's foreign ministry, and I asked them, what are the demands of the Russian government? And they referred me to a March 29th, 2023 interview given by the Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, Mikhail Galuzin. And he put forward about 8 demands, and I'm going to go through them very quickly, one by one. Demand number 1, the cessation of hostilities by Ukrainian armed formations and supply of weapons by Western countries, as well as the withdrawal of foreign mercenaries. Well, of course, that would have to be reciprocal. If Ukraine is going to lay down its arms, if they're going to stop the flow of weapons, Russia would have to do likewise. It would have to stop shipping weapons into these areas that are disputed, that it purports to have annexed, and it would have to stop shooting. And really, there's no reason to believe that the Russians wouldn't do that if, on the other side, there was nonviolence. Demand number 2, Ukraine's neutral and non-aligned status. So the Russian Federation wants Ukraine out of NATO. Well, this would simply be honoring the promise that NATO governments made to Mikhail Gorbachev over 30 years ago, and which they violated repeatedly with disastrous consequences for the Ukrainian people. And furthermore, whatever you may make of this promise, I think the sensible, rational thing for us as Westerners to want is a buffer between Russia's forces, its nuclear armed forces, and NATO's nuclear armed forces. And people will say, well, what's going to happen to the Ukrainians? Well, what happened to the Swiss? What happened to the Finns? What happened to Sweden, all of which remained outside of NATO for decades? They managed to be prosperous countries. They weren't attacked by Russia. They had robust trade relations with Europe and with Canada and the United States. There's no reason why Ukraine as a neutral country couldn't prosper in the way that Austria, Switzerland, and Sweden did. There's absolutely no reason. In fact, in many ways, Ukraine is better positioned to prosper because of its natural resources. Now, people say Ukraine has a right to join NATO. That's just not true. No country has a right to join NATO. NATO is a voluntary alliance. People, states have come together, they've made a contract. Article 10 of that contract says that any member of NATO can veto the entry of any other country into NATO. All it takes is one country, under the terms of their contract, to say no, and that's it. An applicant can't be admitted to NATO. How do you get from this treaty the idea that any country, Ukraine or otherwise, has a right to join NATO? No, they don't have a right. NATO is perfectly entitled to say no to Ukraine and anybody else. In fact, I would say they're committed to do so because they promised the government of the Soviet Union that that's what they would do. Not just with respect to Ukraine, but all Eastern European countries. Demand number 3, confirmation of Ukraine's nuclear-free status. Well, I don't know about you, but this to me is a no-brainer. I don't want any country that doesn't have nuclear weapons to get the nukes. I want them to be dismantled. So I would think that we in the West would favor, which is effectively what we've agreed to do under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We ourselves don't have nukes. Why would we want any country to get nuclear weapons? This is a demand we should support. Demand number 4, recognition by Kiev and the international community of its new territorial realities are essential. And in my opinion, this is the most difficult issue. Okay, Russia is signaling that it wants territorial concessions from Ukraine unequivocally. What is interesting, however, and I say this as a lawyer, who has spent a career trying to parse through the language used by my adversaries, is this phrase, territorial realities. The Russian Federation has never said you have to give us every inch of the 4 oblasts that we have annexed. They don't control every inch of these oblasts. They've said territorial realities. So it's possible, I don't know, that if you sit down with the Russians, they'll say, yes, you're going to have to cede some territory to us, but there's territory we're prepared to give up, even though formally we have annexed that territory. Now people will say, well, that's outrageous. Why should Ukraine make territorial concessions? How can we redraw the borders? We've been redrawing the borders, we in the West, ladies and gentlemen, and all over the world for decades. Western powers have redrawn the borders of the Middle East in ways that were profoundly contrary to the interests of those peoples. They did the same thing in Africa during the colonial era. They redrew the borders of Serbia. They carved out of the heart of Serbia, Kosovo. Contrary to the adamant objections of the Serbian government. Today, the United States government is giving $4 billion in military aid every year to Israel, and Israel is just stealing Palestinian land, brazenly stealing its land, in front of the eyes of the world. We're not only not tolerating it, we're facilitating it. And now we're going to tell the Russians, oh no, borders are inviolable. There can be no territorial concessions. That's not reasonable. Ultimately, what I think we should do here, this is the really tough issue in my opinion, is we should propose to the Russians that there be internationally supervised plebiscites in these regions. Not referenda that are done under Russian control, under Ukrainian control, but under the control of the international community on terms that are agreed to by both the Ukrainian and the Russian governments, and let the peoples of these regions decide. Because, ladies and gentlemen, there's something called the right to self-determination. This is a human right. We recognize it when it suits our purposes, and we pretend it doesn't exist when it doesn't suit our purposes. And in the case of Ukraine, our governments are pretending that the right to self-determination doesn't exist. If you don't agree that the referenda that were conducted there were legitimate, fine. Let's organize referenda that are legitimate, that we can all support and trust. But no, that's not even something that we're prepared to contemplate on our side. Demand number 5, the denationalization of Ukraine. Again, this is ambiguous language, hard to know what they mean. If I were proposing to the Russian government a set of solutions or prescriptions to address this concern, this is what I would say. I would say, you should demand that the Ukrainian parliament rescind the national holiday for Stepan Bandera. Why anybody in the West would object to that, I can't imagine. Does anybody in this room think it's a good idea to declare a national holiday for somebody like Stepan Bandera? So that would be number 1. Number 2, dismantle and disarm the ultranationalist and neo-Nazi brigades in the Ukrainian military and security services. Again, why anybody in the West would object to this is beyond me. And finally, launch an educational program in Ukraine to inform Ukrainians, particularly young Ukrainians, about the realities of Stepan Bandera and his odious legacy. Now maybe if you propose something like that to the Russians, they would accept it. We don't know unless we try. And why anybody would object to this on our side is, as I say, something that would mystify me. Demand number 6, protection of the rights of Russian-speaking citizens, the Russian language and national minorities. Well, we do this in our country. We protect minority language rights. Why shouldn't we expect Ukraine to do that? And of course, if territory is ceded to Russia, Russia should also undertake an obligation to protect the language rights of Ukrainians, Ukrainian speakers and ethnic Ukrainians living in the territories that are ceded to Russia. In fact, Russia should give that undertaking with respect to its entire territory, the entirety of the Russian Federation. Demand number 7, free cross-border movement with Russia, lifting of anti-Russian sanctions by Ukraine in the West, and the withdrawal of lawsuits. Well, I think that this is something that would benefit us. Russia last year became the largest exporter of wheat. Russia has massive energy resources. Europe was able to maintain its current or its previous quality of life, particularly Germany, because it had access to abundant supplies of relatively inexpensive Russian gas. Since they cut off the supply of Russian gas, what has happened? Germany has substantially increased its consumption of coal, which is far dirtier than gas, and now it's buying far more liquefied natural gas from the United States, which is not only dirtier, but is also much more expensive. So this is hurting the economies of Europe. And I showed you earlier, the IMF is projecting that the German economy will contract this year and the Russian economy will grow. that will tell you something about how these sanctions are hurting the West. They're weakening Europe. So we should support the removal of these sanctions, and whatever you may think about the practical implications of that, the fact remains they're a violation of international law. They are not approved by the UN Security Council. Demand number 8, it's important to restore, this is the final demand, Ukraine's legal and contractual framework with Russia, as well as with Western funding the civilian infrastructure destroyed by the AFU after 2014. I'm not sure what this means, to be perfectly candid about it, but personally I feel that this is an unreasonable demand. It's straight up unreasonable. Russia has far more resources to fund the reconstruction of Ukraine than Ukraine has to fund its own reconstruction. And Russia should contribute massively to the reconstruction of Ukraine. And as some of you will know, Western governments have frozen some $300 billion US in Russian central bank assets. I think that money, there's a lot you can say about the legality of what they've done, but that money would be a very good place to start in terms of reconstructing the country of Ukraine, which has been so devastated by this war and will be far more devastated if it continues. Thank you very much for your patience, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dimitri. Again, it was insightful. There was a lot there, so I think there's going to be a lot of questions that folks have. So what I am proposing to do, okay, good, is if someone has a question, yeah, please just raise your hand. I'll try and keep track, and then I'll give you the mic.
Thank you.
Okay, right. Sorry. Before we start.
Yes. Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming out tonight and listening to Dimitri Lascaris' masterful presentation. I would be remiss as treasurer of the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War if I didn't ask for a voluntary contribution. I understand that people paid $5 and $10. That was a token admission price in order to establish the fact that this was a ticketed assembly and only those people who bought tickets could come in. But if you have any money left over in your pocket and you want to support the work, the good work, the anti-war work that the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War does, please just throw whatever you can into the hat as I go by, and we'd appreciate it very much. Thank you.
So I think we can maybe take the questions while Ken is moving around. We'll start down here, and then I'll wait for make our way up to the back here.
Thank you very much, Dimitri, for this clarification and for this informative presentation. Concerning the war, this war, and the information that you have given concerning this war, actually, I do sympathize with the Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. And I see that the Ukrainian people who are suffering in this war. Therefore, I think that I do appreciate if peace is prevailed in this area. Yeah, I think that I'm calling the Ukraine to think about whether this war is for interest, for their benefits, or for the benefits of the others. And in this respect, I wanted to assess with you the honesty of the NATO countries, the Western countries. They are saying that they are supporting Ukraine because Russia have occupied part of the Ukraine land. It's okay. No country is permitted to occupy part of the other country. But the same countries, the NATO countries, in the same time, in the other part of the world, of the globe, they are supporting the occupation. They are supporting, as you said, the Palestinian land. They are supporting the occupation of the Syrian land, part of the Syrian land, Golan Heights. So how, if we can assess the honesty of these countries, they are against the occupation here. How come you are supporting the occupation in the other part of the globe? So this is the message to the Ukrainian people to think about whether this war for the benefit they are suffer, their houses are destroyed, they became an immigrant and refugee. So I think that they needed to rethink about this war and the reason that you get about it. Thank you.
I agree completely with what you guys said.
I'll make my bed. Actually, if it's okay, I'm going to hold on to my.
Sure. So I have a question of curiosity. I'm tremendously concerned about the rise of neo-Nazism. And I know that you said that you were mystified by it and that you said it was an odious legacy and huge problem. One thing that has really troubled me as I followed the issue is, and I want to say that many of my best teachers, my formidable educators in my past have been Jewish, including my master's thesis supervisor was Dimitri. And it bothers me, in the spirit of his memory in particular, as an international lawyer, may or may not have been familiar with him, but I can tell you about him another time. But the Jewish community silence, I don't understand it. How could these facts not be known? And I know that in this area, my father had mentioned to me that there is a monument in a cemetery in Oakville, Ontario, to Bandera, in a Ukrainian church. And I didn't really believe him, but I started looking at it. It seemed outlandish to me. So I started looking online, and everyone is welcome to do the same. But the local mayor and the Jewish community in Griff tried to have that monument removed, and our federal government would not do it. And so I want to sort of dovetail too. It needs to be said, I think, that, you know, I'm worried about the audience and the temper of the audience, but our Deputy Prime Minister has not disavowed her family's Nazi past. So these are profound issues, and from everything I follow from the Russian perspective, they need to be accounted for. I look at the other day, Putin screened to his audience. I haven't seen it yet, I saw some of the images, but you know, a story about the rise of neo-Nazism and the Holocaust to ensure that these, you know, that these facts are never forgotten.
Yeah, I think it's so extraordinary. I mean, it goes even beyond what we quite rightly identified. Very recently, the Ukrainian military, I mean, all indications are that the Ukrainian military was involved in this, armed Russian neo-Nazis to attack Russian civilians in the Belgorod region. Even Western media were acknowledging that these people were neo-Nazis. So they're recruiting neo-Nazis in Russia, and we're told that by the worst critics of Vladimir Putin that his government is nuts. I've heard that said. He's Hitler. Why are Russian neo-Nazis attacking his government if he's a Nazi? And our side is helping them. They actually entered into Russian territory with American military hardware. Think about the insanity of that. The one thing I want to say about the Jewish community, however, is that, I mean, there are lots of members of the Jewish community who are deeply alarmed at what's going on in Ukraine and our support for the neo-Nazis. I'll just give you one example, but I could go on and on. One example, of course, is one of the bravest journalists in the West today, and that's Aaron Monte. He's a member of the Jewish community. He's given extensive coverage to the problem, the severe problem of neo-Nazis in Ukraine. The problem, you know, we have in the West is that the only representatives of the Jewish community who are recognized are those whose points of view are consistent with the pro-war agenda of the United States government. We don't talk about the other members of the Jewish community. Just like when we talk about Palestine, no one almost never will tell you what Independent Jewish Voices has to say, which recognizes that Israel is an apartheid state, but they're only too happy to tell you what the neighbor, the Senator for Israel and Jewish Affairs has to say, because they deny Israel as an apartheid state. So it's important when we talk about the Jewish community to recognize that there's a tremendous amount of intellectual diversity in the community, just like there is in the Ukrainian community. My event in Winnipeg is being sponsored by a Ukrainian-Canadian organization. They disagree with the policies favored by the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. So let's not confuse what the media tells us these communities think with what these communities actually think. Ken, you put your hand up.
Yes, sir. As far as anti-Semitism and all that, that we're talking about from World War II. Just wanted to point out President Poroshenko, his father was Jewish. The President, and by the way, under Poroshenko's Prime Minister Grossman was a Jew. And now Zelensky is a Jew. So playing that anti-Semitic card is kind of hard. Excuse me. Now, another thing I'd like to point out, first of all, I'm a proud Canadian of Ukrainian descent. My father was arrested by the Russians. He was in the Polish army. He escaped from Germany, came back to Ukraine. He was arrested by the Red Army, and incarcerated in an infamous gulag. Now, just some information. Kiev dates back to 461. So archaeologists say 6th century. Moscow never appeared till about 860. 800 and whatever. Kiev and Rus is the mother of that territory. Ukraine has always been invaded by the West, the South, the Tartars, the Turks. Everybody wanted a piece of Ukraine. And I just spent 3 months in Ukraine. I was 3 months back in March, and I toured eastern Ukraine. And why is Ukraine so heroically fighting? You mentioned the odds. They're tired of the Russification that's been going on for centuries. My father was part of that Russification. And these people that I met, a lot of them are Russian speaking, the soldiers in eastern Ukraine. I met them, I have pictures here. They speak Russian, but they want no part of Russia. Anywhere where Russia goes, look what they did in Chechnya. They're doing it to Ukraine. And why? Nobody twisted Poland's arm to join NATO. Nobody twisted the Baltic countries to join NATO. They know what Russia's all about. And Russia is not about NATO. Russia does not want a democratic country like Ukraine on its border. Simple as that.
Well, sir, I believe wholeheartedly that the Ukrainian people deserve a sovereign state. Wholeheartedly. And I have no doubt, and I won't question for 1 minute, that there are millions upon millions of Ukrainians who share your views. But I think we also have to take into account that there are people there who feel a strong affinity to Russia. They do. You know, I don't purport to know what proportion of the Ukrainian population, if I may, I allow you to speak, falls into that category. I think we need to have internationally supervised plebiscites to really figure that out. But I've met these people. I've talked to them. You can find them all over the media. People from Ukraine who want nothing more to do with the Ukrainian government. They view it as being a nationalist pro-Ukrainian government that is suppressing their rights as Russian speakers. They want to have a close relationship with Russia. They have family members in Russia, many of these people. And we have to find a way to reconcile these legitimate aspirations of both yourself, people who agree with you, and Ukrainians who have a different view. And if that can't be done, then I think the answer is partition.
Well, just to mention, we're all familiar, or some of us are familiar with the Ukrainian famine that started.
Oh, easy, sorry. We can come back to Navy after we go around a little bit more.
Vince Cerrito, short intro, and then a question. So, it's probably Canadian. Okay. Looking at, I believe Vladimir Putin is a war criminal, and I think he should be held accountable for his actions, but I believe it's up to the Russian people to hold Vladimir Putin accountable for his actions. And I'm really pleased that Americans have a newfound interest in holding war criminals accountable for their action. And I feel that they should lead by example and then show the Russians how it's done. But as a Canadian, my concern is with Canadian leaders and Canadian decisions. And I'd like your comments in 2014, during the Main Square, a group of Ukrainians, right-wing nationalists, sought refuge in the Canadian embassy. There was fighting going on. They came to the Canadian embassy, they held the doors open for them, they gave them refuge, they were letting them come and go, participate in the thing. And I would like to hold Canadian leaders who were involved in all of that, like who decided to let those guys in, and what were we doing, and the level of involvement that Canada was in. We were not, outside. We were not neutral in that conflict. I believe that we were arming and training or whatever. So, what is your take on the 2014 Canadian embassy giving refuge to participants, and who should we be holding accountable
for Canada's involvement in the violent overthrow of the democratically elected Ukrainian government?
I think, the Harper government, which we've thankfully rid ourselves of, bears some of that responsibility, and of course, the Trudeau government is deeply complicit. It's not just the shameful incident like that, but of course there was the training, as I pointed out in my presentation, of Ukrainian neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian military. I mean, this is, I don't know how Canadians are shocked by this. How can we allow this to go on? How can we continue to put into power a government that is willing to ally itself with the most reprehensible elements in international affairs purely to serve the purposes of the United States government? That's what our government does. This is not in the interest of Canadians. Not even in the interest of Ukrainian Canadians. It's not in the interest of Ukrainians in Ukraine or in Canada that there be neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian military. It's not in anybody's interest. It's shocking that our government has done these things, but this is the way they've done business for decades.
I'm making my way back there, just so folks know.
Good evening. Thanks for letting me speak. Sorry about my outburst earlier. With that said, I'm a proud Canadian. I'm born here in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. My parents are of Ukrainian descent. They escaped the Red Army during World War II, were held in deportation camps in Germany, made their way over to Canada, worked their lives here to build a future for their children. I don't appreciate being called one of them by you, because I'm here. Are you any different than me? You can call me a loser if you want, because I feel passionate about how I feel. And that's your right, because we're in Canada, you're allowed to do that. My name is Konstantin Shaweli. I'm the president of the Ukrainian National Federation here in Hamilton. I'm very proud of what I do and what I represent. So, I want to go back to my initial comments during my outburst. So, you mentioned Crimea and Russia. In 1954, Khrushchev gave Crimea back to Ukraine for whatever reason, whether who it belonged to, whatever. Under the UN Charter, it belongs to Ukraine. That's it. The indigenous people of Crimea, who are the Crimean Tatars, have been unlawfully deported and oppressed for hundreds of years. Even their elected, legitimate leader had to escape. You can find that representation here in Canada. So I'd like you to clarify your stance when you say Crimea and Russia, because what's the difference if you're claiming it's part of Russia, but it's not part of Ukraine? It was an autonomous region under the Ukrainian government. So what's your stance on that? Neo-Nazism. So during World War II and before World War II, you had partisans that were fighting for a free Ukraine. You had KGB officers dressing up as Ukrainian soldiers committing atrocities. Now I'm not saying that Ukrainian soldiers or these partisans weren't committing atrocities as well. After this gentleman mentioned earlier on that Ukraine has been attacked over the centuries, they don't want anybody in their country if you're not Ukrainian. So yes, probably bad things happened. But to say that they're neo-Nazis, by your numbers earlier, 4 to 6 times larger of a population Russia has than Ukraine, you don't think there's neo-Nazis in Russia? And by numbers, that contingent should be much larger than what's in Ukraine. But we don't hear about the neo-Nazis in Russia. You can watch the football games there, or soccer games as we call it over here. You'll see neo-Nazis in there spreading widely. You don't talk about that, do you? I'm mentioning this. I'm asking to clarify, and under the plethora of misleading comments that were made, I don't have the platform, and I'll keep it short because I was given 2.5 minutes earlier. In 2004, there was an orange revolution in Ukraine where the President Yanukovych that you mentioned won the election. And during a recount, due to mass protests, it was found, because Canada sent 500 election monitors as well as other UN nations, found that these votes were miscounted. And he lost the election, and President Yushchenko was awarded that presidency. In 2008, Yanukovych was elected. Okay? 2014.
He was not elected.
I'm asking a question, sorry. 2010, it's every 6 years. 2014, there was a referendum in Ukraine, and the people voted overwhelmingly to join the European Union. There was no mention of NATO. Ukrainians never wanted to join NATO. And then on the night of signing that decree, Yanukovych took a $3 billion bribe from his buddy Putin to join Putin's new, let's call it, new Soviet Union. Then the people revolted because they wanted to join the European Union. Now, are there outside factors and influences that probably help support or fuel this fire? I bet you there are, because people have interest in Ukraine, and I don't like that. Ukrainians want to be free. But because the Americans are involved, does that make Russia the good guys? They're still our adversaries.
Those two questions, okay? So one is about the status of Crimea. The second one about if there's intervention in Ukraine.
One more
on
thing.
one side,
If
there
you
should
spoke
be
out
intervention.
against, sorry, I apologize. If you spoke out against Putin in Russia, the way you speak out against our government here, or if the people in the U.S. spoke out against here, are they showing up dead? Are the political opponents and dissidents showing up dead, getting thrown off balconies? Look at the truckers, are they dead right now? This room would be empty right now if you guys spoke out like this in Russia. Be happy here in Canada, enjoy your democracy, and thank you for giving me my word. You call me a loser. A lot of people want us to oppose this. They do something to you.
You've asked a question of the status of Crimea.
Clarify, please.
First of all, thank you for coming. And I imagine it was hard for you to hear what I had to say.
It was very difficult.
I know, and I really appreciate the fact that you know, it was a minor outburst. It happens. On the whole, you were very attentive and respectful, and I appreciate that. Even now in your comments. Okay, so, I can't stress enough how important it is that we find ways to have this discussion, as hard as it is. When it comes to, first of all, you said a lot in there that I disagree with, as a historical matter. Okay, and I just, in the amount of time available to me, I couldn't go through it all. For example, things you said about 2004, I disagree with some aspects of your narrative. Okay, but I'm just trying to keep focused on the main points you made. Crimea. Yes, in 1954, Khrushchev, at the time when Ukraine and Russia were part of the USSR, transferred for reasons that nobody really understands Crimea from the Russian Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian Socialist Republic. At the time that he did that, no one was imagining that, you know, some 35 years later, Ukraine was going to be exiting the Soviet Union and become an independent state. Okay, so the fact that Khrushchev did this at a time when they were all part of the same country, I don't personally feel is dispositive either legally or morally of the status of Crimea today. Okay, I think that you also have to take into account that it was for 200 years part of the Russian Federation, and there is a Russian-speaking population there, not just Tatars, and you're right, they have been oppressed. But that was primarily by the Soviet government, particularly Stalin, who did that to the Tatars. Okay, but the fact of the matter is that this is a complex issue. And at the end of the day, what I'm saying to you is, how can you in good conscience object to what the people of Crimea themselves want? You know, we do not in international law ascribe to the view that borders are inviolable. As I've said, we also recognize the right to self-determination. And we give the legal blessing and the blessing of the international community to right movements to self-determination around the world. We've done this repeatedly. This is what we're doing now in Serbia with respect to the people of Kosovo over the strong objections of the Serbians. So that also has to be taken into account. This is not a black and white issue. This is the bottom line. You know, legal questions are not often simply black and white. Most of the time, in my experience as a lawyer, good counsel can argue complex issues both ways, and you really don't know how they would play out in a court of law. I think if you got into an international court of law on this issue, I'm not entirely sure how they would decide it. But at the end of the day, it should be the people of Crimea who decide.
But you're not answering my question. Well, you say Russia and Crimea. Well, Crimea is not Crimea, it's either part of Russia or part of Ukraine. Which one is it?
Well, you have two competing legal claims.
It's complicated.
Yeah. So you have two competing legal claims. Again, what I'm saying to you is, you think that this is simply a binary issue, and that there's no complexity to it. It's either Russia or Ukraine. It's not clear, in my opinion. That's my legal opinion. Especially when you take into account the right of self-determination. It's complex, and I'll tell you one thing. I'm no military expert, but what I saw when I was there, I told you that I went all the way up to the border with Kherson, and as you probably know as a Ukrainian, Crimea is attached to the Ukrainian mainland by two narrow pieces of land, right? When I drove through one of those pieces of land, I saw fortifications up the wazoo. I can't, and it's flat land, there's no cover. Either side, it's bordered by large, it's flanked by large bodies of water. I assure you, and you don't need to believe me, you can consult Western military experts. If the Ukrainians attempt to retake Crimea by force, there's going to be a massacre. A massacre. We have to find a way. It is not in the interest of the Ukrainian people that they attempt to take Crimea by force. We have to find a way to resolve this issue peacefully.
Excuse me, we have to move on. Either you have to go.
You're not sure who's
Either you have to go.
Yes.
Okay,
I'm giving you my legal judgment. That's
okay, so
my
you're
legal
not
judgment.
sure who it belongs to. That's all I want. That was my question. Thank you.
He said that 3 times, but all right, that's good, okay.
Dimitri, thank you very much for taking the time and the funds for this initiative. We all appreciate it, and we need more people like you in Canada. I have 2 quick questions. Why Ukraine and not Finland? Like, you know, the borders between Russia and Finland is huge. And now it's in the NATO, I guess, Finland. So just
Why, do you want my opinion about why Finland made that decision?
like, what's the future for Finland?
I think that the Finnish government lost its mind. I mean, it's perfectly blunt, but I think that the Finnish government has lost its mind. I don't know, like, this whole business of NATO is leading to the destruction of Ukraine, and they want to now become, in effect, the kind of threat to Russia that Russia perceived a NATOized Ukraine to be. They're putting their people at risk. There was absolutely no indication that before Finland acceding to NATO membership, that Russia planned to attack Finland. There was never any threat that it was going on that. And for decades, they lived in peace. Why did they become members of NATO? Don't they see what's happening in Ukraine as a result of the NATO threat?
The second one, are you going to see the green leadership again? And we want you to.
Excuse me.
I'm no expert, but I think we are overstating the neo-Nazi element. Some in Ukraine joined with the Nazis to fight the Russians to have some freedom. They were being exploited, oppressed, the Ukrainian people, and they thought Germany would be their freedom. And they're not the only people in this world who have done that in the past. Linked arms with those they thought would save them. That continues. A militia to keep Ukrainian independence. I think we're overstating that big time. I do. I think we have neo-Nazis in Canada. In fact, I know 2 who make no bones about it. So let's stop that nonsense and making it sound so extreme. Let me say something else.
You have a question?
Yes.
What's your question?
Are you aware that the patriarch of the Orthodox Church in Moscow is absolutely livid that the patriarch of Constantine gave the Ukrainian Orthodox Church independence? Even there, Ukraine is not allowed to have their independence. In fact, that patriarch Kirill says all of these eastern states belong to Mother Russia. They are baptized with the same waters as Kiev. He said that because the World Council of Churches has gone there 5 times to appeal to him, to say, pray for peace, stand against your government for peace, stand for world peace. So even the patriarch wants Mother Russia to come together. My daughter's in-laws are Polish. They escaped Poland under Russia. Are you aware that Poland, they're visiting Poland, they live in Canada now, my daughter's in-laws. Poland is afraid they are going to be invaded. They are afraid.
So is that a reason?
So that's the question. Are you aware of that? Have you interviewed any of these people?
That's a question, serious question. You said it'll facilitate the discussion if you could really just sort of prioritize what it is you want to talk to me about and not try to throw it into.
Well, you make it sound like the Western press. You make it sound like the Western press. Let him speak, sir. Okay.
First of all, I never said, and I never believed, that all Ukrainians are neo-Nazis, or that even most Ukrainians are neo-Nazis. I don't believe that for 1 second. I believe the vast majority of Ukrainians are not neo-Nazis. But I also think that neo-Nazis have acquired an extraordinary degree of power in Ukraine through the use of violence. And they have effectively been given impunity for their violence. That's what makes them so dangerous. It's not their numbers. It's their methods and the impunity that has been attached to their atrocities. I don't think you'll see neo-Nazism rise normally in conditions where majorities support them. Most peoples in the history of neo-Nazism do not support neo-Nazis, but they used violence in order to seize the power of the state, and I think they've done that to some degree, to a large degree in Ukraine, notwithstanding the fact that its president is Jewish. Now, as far as the Polish people are concerned, sure, I'm aware. I don't need to interview people from Poland to know that they fear a Russian invasion, because we hear that all the time in the press. What I'm trying to do is to talk to people about things that are being suppressed by the mainstream media. We all know that. And frankly, my message to the Polish people is, what are you thinking? What reason do you have to believe that this government, this Russia, not the Soviet Union, this Russia intended to attack you? Seriously, you think that Russia believes that it can take on the entirety of NATO? Russia, look at the problems that Russia is encountering simply to defeat the Ukrainian army on its border. Anybody, I think, who believes this nonsense, that Russia intended to reconstitute the Soviet Union, including by invading Poland, is frankly drinking the NATO Kool-Aid. Let's be very clear.
I'm Dave Thomas. I'm chair of the Canadian Cuban Friendship Association at Niagara. And I must say this is my lucky evening to be in the presence of two of my heroes, you, Dimitri, and Aiden here, and sitting in front of me. I would just like to point out how this war in Ukraine is dragging the reputations of other nations into it, as in Cuba being associated as being an ally of Russia. And also now there's been talk about them being in association with China and Iran. This is being used as an excuse here in Canada. We've had 4 CBC articles by Evan Dwyer in as many months, accusing Cuba of human rights violations, which is ludicrous. You don't see countries that educate the people to the level they have in Cuba and brought on not the quality of life, I'm sorry, because of the blockade, but life expectancy and very low infant mortality. They are not abusive nations by any stretch of the imagination. So, no, I'm just pointing out that this war has been used as an excuse to affect relations with other countries. Canada has diplomatic relations with them. Thank you.
Well, I thank you for your kind remarks, and I think you reminded me of the importance of mentioning the big picture. The big picture, which I didn't say anything about, is that the world is entering an era of multipolarity. The era of U.S. hegemony is over, and the elites in the West they simply refuse to accept it, and they're willing to throw the Ukrainian people under the bus in order to perpetuate their fantasy of global domination for as long as possible. That's what's happening. And the consequences for the West are utterly disastrous. Okay, look at the influence that China now has. You mentioned the case of Iran. China just did something incredible. It negotiated, it mediated a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now it's entered into a strategic alliance with the Palestinian people. Then you see, as you mentioned, these relations between Cuba and China. The BRICS, there are people lining up across the global south to join the BRICS. The West is becoming isolated and weaker. This is even purely from a self-interested perspective. This policy is an absolute disaster for those of us living in the West. It's contrary to the strategic interests of our own countries. And the people who will suffer the most are the Ukrainian people themselves.
Thank you again so much for giving this presentation, Dimitri. I did want to bring something to light that I felt is very, very important, and then I do have a very important question for you as well. My friend that had left, I would hope he just left and gone to the washroom rather than stay and just kind of leave after he asked his question. But he mentioned that we should all be grateful and thankful for being in Canada. I'm an Iranian. I can tell you, as an Iranian Canadian, life in Canada is not all roses and peaches. I can assure you, as an Iranian Canadian, my fellow Iranian Canadians, for something as simple as going to Iran for a visit, have had their mortgages shut down. I have lots of friends who are Chinese. In fact, you can ask over 100 Chinese professors at a lot of different universities here in Ontario if they're being investigated by CSIS, simply for being Chinese. So no, we're not necessarily lucky to be in Canada. In fact, we've been exploited enough where we've had to be sent to Canada in order to have some kind of a semblance of livelihood. A semblance of livelihood. With that said, I also believe, as Dimitri, you mentioned rapprochement. And I think that something that's very, very important, especially with your trip to Russia, is to get the perspective of all different sorts of people in Russia. There's 15 million people in Russia. Sorry, 15 million Ukrainians currently living in Russia. Were you able to, at the very least, speak with any Ukrainians living in Russia? And if so, what did they have to say?
Yes, I mentioned this math professor from, again, I commend to you this article where I laid out in detail what he had to say. He comes from a community which is just about 10 kilometers north of Donetsk in southeastern Ukraine, and his mother is still there. His brother is there. His brother actually fought for the pro-Russian forces. He has friends who have died in the conflict. And he told his father was of Russian origin and his mother was Ukrainian. And he said to me, I have Ukrainian blood. He said, but I no longer identify with that country. When I was growing up, I saw in my own life, he's about, I think, 36 years old now. He said, it was interesting to hear from this gentleman about the Russification of the country. He said something to an opposite impact. He said, in fact, there was a Ukrainianization of the communities that were predominantly Russian, and I was becoming increasingly isolated, increasingly vilified. And when he was telling me this, he actually started crying. He broke down crying. I don't think that this was an acting job. The man he identified as Ukrainian, he was ethnically Ukrainian, and he had given up on Ukraine because he felt that he didn't humanize it. And so I think that there are legitimate feelings on both sides about this. There are reasons why Ukrainian people feel that their culture had been suppressed, of course, under the Soviet Union, which was dominated by Russia, but there are legitimate grievances on the side of the pro-Russian Ukrainian population as well. And war is not the answer. It's not the means by which we will resolve this conflict.
Hi, Dimitri. Thank you so much for your time today. This is really informative. You gave a stat, which I haven't read, about the 30% of Canadians not wanting or not agreeing to sending more armaments to Ukraine. And I think that there's this big misconception that Canada sends millions and millions of dollars of humanitarian aid to Ukraine, when the reality is we send $1 billion worth of arms. Military aid isn't humanitarian aid, people, it's weapons. So how can we, considering that 30% are already, 30% people are Canadians are against,
only 32%
that's only 32% support, sorry, long night. Considering that's the number, that's a really good number, considering this kind of thought is not allowed in the mainstream media. How can we develop more so to adopt this kind of position where we're not effectively at war with Russia as well. Because if we're supplying the weapons, that must mean we're involved, right?
Yeah.
We're at war if we're supplying the weapons. That's how I understand it.
Well, we've gone way beyond that. This tour is an answer to your question. This tour is about having a discussion and informing people about facts that they're not being given by the public. And one thing that I didn't get into, which I think is particularly, would be particularly irksome to a lot of Canadians, particularly Canadians who are poor or want to paycheck away from the disaster that sees billions sent over, is the record of the Zelensky government. The Zelensky government, he's presented to us, Volodymyr Zelensky, as this colossus bestriding the world stage, this Churchillian figure of epically important stature. Volodymyr Zelensky is a kleptocrat, he is a tyrant, he is a human rights abuser, and he's a bald-faced liar. He's banned so-called pro-Russian media outlets. He's banned left-wing parties. He's banned the Libertarian Party. He's adopted laws which place anybody who engages in any sort of cooperation with Russian forces, like accepting humanitarian aid from them, at risk of criminal prosecution and other forms of reprisal. Okay? Cy Hirsch, one of the greatest journalists of our time, he wrote an article recently which was based upon sources he has within the U.S. government, and he was told the CIA estimates that the Zelensky and his inner circle has siphoned off a minimum of $400 million US from Western aid. A minimum. If Canadians knew the truth about Volodymyr Zelensky, you ask me, I'll be very blunt. I think he's a traitor to his people. Yes. I think he's betrayed the Ukrainian people. Yes. And that's the first thing we need to tell our fellow Canadians. He is not who he's presented to be.
Hi, Dimitri. Thank you for your presentation tonight. It's been very informative. I wonder if there was if you noticed some discussion about China when you're in Russia, because I get the sense that looking at this from a broader perspective, Russia seems to have, in recent decades, wanted to become more economically connected to Europe, to be a source of resources for the European economy. And perhaps the U.S. didn't want to see that, to see a threat to their economic power in the world. So I get the sense that this war has the implication of Russia now having, out of necessity, to forego that potential and become subservient economically to China. And basically the Americans seem to have prevented a merger of a Russian-European economy in favor of a Russian and Chinese potential merger, which now they seem to want to prevent by trying to destroy Russia through this war. And then the next step would be Taiwan and going after China as if in the sense of Ukraine being the next, or sorry, Taiwan being the next Ukraine. So I wonder if in your journey in Russia, if there was any discussion amongst the people of maybe some concern or sense of loss that they have that potential for a connection to Europe, and now that permanently it may be severed in favor of a subservient relationship with the Chinese economy.
Everybody that I spoke to expressed strong fondness and admiration for China and a deep sense of appreciation for the Chinese government's position. I'm sure there's some of that sentiment there. I personally did not encounter it. Concern that, because of course China has a gigantic economy. As I said, arguably the largest economy in the world. And so they're very concerned about that, but the Russians, I think, are also cognizant of the fact that they have essential resources that China desperately needs. With a population of some 1.4, 1.5 billion people. So I don't think most Russians view this as being a lopsided relationship. They think this is a partnership of equals, fundamentally, and it's in the interest of their countries of just strengthening. And this is a strategic disaster for the West. I mean, even Zbigniew Brzezinski, the ultimate neocon, said that the worst possible outcome would be an alliance between Russia, for U.S. hegemony, would be an alliance between Russia and China. Well, this is what they've managed to orchestrate by simultaneously trying to destabilize Taiwan and destabilizing Ukraine. They put them together, and now together they constitute an insurmountable obstacle to U.S. power. They're too strong together for the U.S. to dominate the world any longer, but they don't accept this in Washington. And we're playing along with this fantasy that we can stop this.
Just wanted to say thank you for speaking here. I really appreciate it within our current political climate. It's not just like back in the day where it was a political disagreement before people. It's really polarizing nowadays and people can lose their jobs over this. So you're very brave for speaking out on this. I had two questions. The first concerns what actual Westerners can do to affect the policy of their governments because, you know, as you stated, the dialogue coming from Russia when speaking about our own governments is much more diplomatic and reasonable, showing they're the ones actually interested in peace and diplomacy versus our own talk. And you also showed the history of like U.S. intervention in Kosovo, in the Middle East, all over the world. It's very clear that the West is the aggressor in this conflict. So how do you think we as Westerners can actually affect our government towards a policy of peace? And my second question concerns the policy of like a multipolar world, as you said, and de-dollarization. I was just wondering, given that the effects of U.S. economic warfare on Russia has actually backfired and led to the rest of the world becoming more united economically against America, do you see the process of de-dollarization as inevitable?
So, with respect to your first, I'll answer your first question by telling you a story which I first heard from Chris Hedges. Chris Hedges came many years ago to speak to a crowd at the United Church on Bloor Street in Toronto. And he said that in the memoir of Kissinger, he recounts how during the protests against the Vietnam War, at the height of those protests, the Washington police had surrounded the White House with buses to act as barricades. And he and Nixon were standing in some room, ornate room, looking out upon the protesters across the lawn of the White House. And Nixon looks at him pensively and he says, "Henry, they're coming to get us." And months later, he ended the Vietnam War. You want to know how you can put a stop to this travesty? You have to make them feel like we're coming to get them. And that means you support organizations like the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. We don't have a peace movement in this country. It's evaporated. We have to revive it, and we have to make them fear, the wrath of the people, frankly. Your second question was related to de-dollarization. Yes, I think this is absolutely inevitable. But there's a much more complicated process than simply agreeing to trade in national currencies, because the dollar is not used simply to facilitate trade. It's used within the global financial system, and it's going to take, I think, decades for us to completely de-dollarize. But I think the global south and the East Asia, they've had enough of the U.S. using the dollar as a bludgeon to impose its will on vulnerable economies. And the only way that they can ultimately put a stop to this, and by the way, the fact that we use the dollar as the reserve currency allows the United States government to borrow gigantic sums of money for rock-bottom interest rates and continue to fund the military-industrial complex, which they then use to perpetuate U.S. power. So we have to end our reliance upon the U.S. dollar. I think China and Russia and all of the BRICS countries have come to that conclusion, and it's just a matter of time.